Hey, good evening, everybody, and you're all very welcome. I know that we're small in number here at St. David's Church, but there's a great many of you who are watching online, so hello to you all, and it's lovely that you're here. We're going to have a really fascinating lecture tonight about Maudlin Cemetery and all the different graves and burials. Just to say that before our keynote speaker, that if you would like to donate to the Follies Trust, the website of the Follies Trust is folliestrust.org, and all donations are very welcome. And also there'll be a question and answer session at the end for everybody who's here. Obviously, you can ask in person, but if you look on your webinar portal, there's a little Q&A section that you can answer. So as I said, you're all very welcome, and I'm really looking forward to this fascinating evening. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Primrose.
Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Primrose Wilson, and I chair the Follies Trust. I don't know about you, but whenever I'm watching a webinar, I'm usually a couple of minutes late. So I thought I might do some of the thanks at the beginning and give people time to catch up. Maybe you're not like me and always late for everything, but it's lovely to be here in St. David's Church. And it's a most atmospheric church. It's a wonderful site. There's been worship on this site since 1212, apparently. And so that's a long time, and it is really a very important and sacred spot. And we're delighted to be here as the guests of the rector, the Rev'd Philip Heak, and the select vestry. They have been very good to us, and we have worked very well together in this project to restore the two pyramids in Maudlin Cemetery. As well as the rector and the select vestry, we have had two really super contractors, Vernacular Conservation and Bushy Park Ironworks. And Colm gave a lecture recently, Owen gave a lecture last year, and they're both on our website if you're interested in seeing them. We've had a number of lectures during the course of the last year and a half. Andrew Tierney, Owen Madigan, Colm Bagnall, David Winpenny, who is the person who inspired us to want to restore these wonderful pyramids. And we're grateful to them for their scholarship. I'd also like to thank the residents of 12, 13 and 14, the Gallops. They allowed the contractors to put scaffold poles into their garden in order to support the scaffolding for the East Pyramid, and we're very grateful to them. Bridget Loughlin, who is the Heritage Officer for County Kildare, has been an immense supporter and helped throughout this entire project, as have everybody in Kildare County Council, Anne Lowe and other members of staff. And I'd like to thank all of the councillors in Kildare County Council for the support that they have given. We've had a number of funders: Built Heritage Investment Scheme, Creative Ireland, Kildare County Council, the Naas Union of Parishes, the Heritage Council, the Follies Trust, the Primrose Trust, Kildare Archaeological Society, and the McAleese, Gallivan and Garrett families, and lots of individuals who gave donations and contributions, and we are very grateful to you all for that. So I thought I'd do the thanks first. David Winpenny actually once wrote in his book, which is called Up to a Point, and he said, "Naas is unique. Nowhere else in these islands are there two large pyramids in such close proximity. They need to be conserved." And that's exactly what we have done with your help over the last 18 months. And as I say, it has been a joy working with everybody, and thank you. So tonight, it's going to be, this is the last lecture in the series, and we always keep the best to the last. And I'm delighted to say that Brian McCabe is speaking on a lasting habitation not made with human hands, Maudlin's burial ground, Naas. Brian is a retired civil servant and author. He's a member of KIL History Group, and he's chair of the Federation Committee of Kildare Local History. And he's been immensely helpful to us in the Follies Trust, and any time we asked him a question, he was always absolutely delighted to answer it. He's extremely knowledgeable, and I know that you are going to enjoy listening to him tonight. It's a great pleasure to hand over to you, Brian. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Primrose, for those kind words of introduction. Our presentation tonight will take the form of two parts. Firstly, I will just speak about the general history of the site of Maudlins Cemetery. And then in the second part, thanks to the photographic skills and video recording expertise of the Rev'd Philip, we recorded some little clips down in the graveyard during the week of some of the more interesting headstones and some of the more interesting characters who are commemorated on them. So we'll offer you that virtual tour of Maudlin Cemetery on this cold winter's night without having to stir from your seats. So, Maudlins, let's begin with the name. The name Maudlin as a place name is fairly widespread. It's widespread in England, also on the east coast of Ireland. It's generally taken as derived from the name Magdalene, as in Mary Magdalene, the biblical character. I actually checked this evening. There are 10 townlands in Ireland, either called Maudlins, Maudlins Town, Maudlins Land. All of them on the east coast, probably not surprising. The historic area of the Pale, the historically English-speaking area. And in most cases, they are to be found outside of towns on the east coast. And this brings into play another factor in that the name has always historically been associated with leper hospitals in medieval times. So there may be a suggestion there that Maudlins, situated as it is outside what would have been the walled town of Naas, might have been the site of some such foundation. And in fact, there are a couple of stones down there, at least two, which are incorporated into later memorials, which look to me as if they're certainly hand-dressed, and it looks like they might have been medieval. So there might have been something down there. The well-known historian in this area, T.J. de Burgh, writing in the early volumes of the Kildare Archaeological Journal, mentions in one of his articles a castle at Maudlins, but it's literally just a throwaway comment. Anyway, we do know for certain that the land down there was church land, probably all through the Middle Ages. We get a description of it, for example, in the 1540s, when the monasteries are dissolved by Henry VIII, and the records are kept of all the different lands belonging to the different monasteries. And the recording is that the land at Maudlins belonged to the Augustinian friary here in Naas, and it's recorded as 20 acres of land in Le Maudlins and parish of Naas. And it's interesting that it's Le Maudlins, probably a survival of the Norman French that they tended to use in official language for quite a long time, even after the language was no longer spoken. So 20 acres of land down there in the tenancy of Nicholas Walker, and the yearly value at that time was 16 shillings. We get another reference to it later on in the reign of Elizabeth I, the 6th year of Elizabeth I, which is 1564. And it records that the Maudlins of Naas contained 4 messuages, just the house and the areas around it, and 20 acres of land, and form part of the possessions of the chantry of St. Mary of the Church of St. David, so this church here where we are tonight. And again, we know historically that there were at least 3 chantries attached to this church in the Middle Ages. And the land down at Maudlins at that stage was held by the representatives of John Donkerley. So again, this is a continuation of the land being leased to various people. A few years later, in 1601, there was another inquisition into land holdings, and again it refers to the 20 acres of land in the Maudlins, parish of Naas, and it's now in the tenure of a Nicholas Walker, and it's valued at 5 shillings at that stage. Now, we do have a civil survey for Kildare. This is moving to the 1650s after the Cromwellian wars and the Cromwellian confiscations. It doesn't mention Maudlin specifically, but a few years later, 1654, we have what's often referred to as a census, which is probably a bit misleading. It was probably more likely a record for taxation purposes. And it does mention Moudlins, is how it's written at the time, as having 6 inhabitants. So there were people living down there at that stage. And as part of that whole aftermath of the Cromwellian confiscations, of course, a number of maps were drawn up right across the country by Sir William Petty. Now, it's not clear from the map whether Maudlins is there or not. There is what looks like Maddenstown just outside Naas in that direction, but the orientation would be wrong. But certainly, a century or so later, it is very definitely on the map. We have a map made in 1783 by Lieutenant Alexander Taylor. It's a cartographically correct map. It predates the First Ordnance Survey, so it's very valuable from that point of view. It gives us a very good picture of the area around here at that time. And on that map, he marks in Maudlins as burying ground. And that becomes a bit ironic in terms of his later life, but we'll see more about that later on. We know that the present cemetery, the land for it, the ground, was donated by Lord Naas. That's the family of Burgh, who were Earls of Mayo, but they also had a large house and estate in this area, Palmerston House. And his family controlled a lot of the activity around this area in the late 18th, early 19th century. And we know this because there's an inscription to that effect on the archway of the cemetery. And again, we'll have that on film later on. Now, another factor, I suppose in the late 18th and early 19th century, one of the big headaches in cemeteries and graveyards was the phenomenon of body snatching. This was very common. The people who engaged in it were known by various names: body snatchers, sack-em-ups, resurrection men. There have been a number of books written on the subject. And we know that Maudlins was the victim of such behaviour. There is a reference again in the writings of T.J. de Burgh in the Archaeological Society journals. And he was particularly good at talking to local people, older people, and he recorded a conversation he had with an old inhabitant of Naas, who told him that in his boyhood, owing to the prevalence of body snatching, the dead had to be watched over day and night for some time after interment. He mentioned the names of several bodies that had been thus taken, amongst others that of a Mr. Moorhead, late governor of Naas Jail. And the jail here in Naas was where the town hall is at the moment. It was a jail before that and a castle before that again. So this unfortunate gentleman, Mr. Moorhead, late governor of Naas Jail, which was taken from Maudlin Cemetery, and he mentioned the gruesome fact of his having seen some of the poor old man's grey hair in the hedge over which the body was lifted. He pointed out the house in which the body snatcher, or sack-em-up as he called him, named Whelan, he names the guy, who was ultimately convicted. It was a regular trade, and carts with wheels covered with leather were employed so as to deaden the sound. So we had body snatching going on down there. I imagine Mr. Moorhead, being the governor of the jail, was probably not a particularly loved individual locally, so that might have been the reason why he was picked on. Anyway, the 1832 Anatomy Act brought an end to this horrendous practice. It was passed following the infamous Burke and Hare case in Scotland. And things became a bit more civilised in graveyards. They could start concentrating on the more normal business of burials and so on. So that's moving into the 19th century. I was lucky enough, we actually carried out a survey of the headstones down in the cemetery in Maudlins. I was looking at my records earlier on, it was actually back in 1989. We transcribed the headstones at that stage. And at that point, I was lucky enough to get a look at the parish registers. They were subsequently moved to the representative church body library in Dublin for safekeeping. But as I say, I had an opportunity just to go quickly through them. And I photocopied the section dealing with Maudlins. This is an entry for 1877, when there was an examination undertaken of the graveyards here in Naas. It goes through each of the graveyards. And in relation to Maudlins, it says this cemetery is used by the Protestant parishioners, their relatives and friends, and containing, as it does, many handsome tombstones, enclosures and monuments, it is important that steps should be taken to keep it in proper order and repair. This duty will now fall on the select vestry, as the incumbent is anxious to resign his rights and life estate in this churchyard. Hitherto it has been in charge of a man named Lawrence Burke, but being old and infirm and having lately removed into the town of Naas, he is not able to pay it that attention to the care of the monuments and the cleaning of the walks which is desirable. We think, therefore, that this churchyard should be placed in the care of some person who would be active and watchful and who could take an interest in keeping it in decent and proper order. We would therefore recommend that a small cottage should be built on one side of the entrance gate, which would be given to the caretaker, rent-free, together with the fees for digging graves and some small salary. An arrangement of this sort is the more desirable, as already some of the tombstones are broken. Some of the monuments and erections are in a state of decay, especially the two monuments facing the gate and the pyramid structure belonging to the Montgomery family. As there are no funds available for this purpose, we think the select vestry should apply to the representatives of the several families whose relatives are buried in this cemetery for subscriptions towards carrying into effect the foregoing recommendations. And it then sets out a list of the charges to be charged up in the cemetery. The opening and closing of graves for a child under 12 years was to be 3 and 6pence. Opening and closing of the grave for an adult, 5 shillings. And it goes on then to draw up a scale of fees for burials, erections of headstones, railings and vaults and so on, erection of mural tablets. And they proposed that this be adopted for Maudlin Cemetery. For the record, the charge for opening a grave was 2 shillings, erecting an upright headstone, £1 1 shilling, a flat headstone, £2 2 shillings, and enclosing a ground with railings, with or without headstone, per square foot, £2 2 and 6pence. So it was 2 and 6pence per square foot. And they say then, in conclusion, we would recommend that a proper map of Maudlin Cemetery be made, marking each grave, enclosure or monument, and that the same be framed and kept in the vestry room of Naas Church. And it may have been, but I don't think it's there any longer. So that was, as I say, a bit of an overhaul. I'll also just mention a few other items that I noted at the time, flicking through the registry. As I say, mostly it's to do with the day-to-day business of operating a cemetery. But occasionally they departed from the more mundane matters, and they weren't above involving themselves in politics, or at least political expressions. For example, on the 27th of April 1886, the vestry minutes record that we, the members of the General Vestry of the United Parishes of Kill and Killashee, wish to place on record our unchangeable loyalty to Her Most Gracious Majesty the Queen and to the Constitution of the country, and earnestly protest against the bill now submitted to Parliament, or any measure whatsoever for the establishment of a separate Parliament for Ireland, being fully persuaded that such a step will be attended with disastrous consequences to our church and religion and to the peace and prosperity of our country. So no doubt about their views at the time, and that motion was proposed by Mr. E. Malloy and seconded by the Baron de Robeck. Another entry then in October 1887, it's resolved that as the new cemetery, exclusively for burial of Roman Catholics, is now finished, that's the Catholic Cemetery St. Corbin's, just out the road, therefore no further such burials are to take place in Maudlins except under exceptional circumstances to be decided by the vicar. I think the interesting thing about that is that it shows that it was open to both denominations up to that point. What else have we got? July 1888, the secretary was directed to ask 2 blacksmiths to look at the gates of Maudlin Cemetery and send in estimates for repairing it. He was also directed to get an estimate for dashing the low wall in front of the cemetery. It was a low wall at this point, so obviously the hedge had been replaced, that poor Mr. Moorhead was hauled over. And to refer the estimates to Mr. W. Sargent, who, if he considered it low enough, was to see the work was properly done. And then in October of that year, resolved that a sum not exceeding £4 10 shillings to be expended on the gates of Maudlin Cemetery. So obviously the repairs went ahead. 1901, October 1901, it was agreed that the church wardens would inquire into the matter of the stable erected against the wall of Maudlin Cemetery. So what was going on down there in 1901? Was it on the inside? Was it on the outside? October 1902 then, we get a record of the first caretaker being appointed. So took quite a while, but he was appointed at that stage. In November of that year, that the Maudlins Committee be asked to mark such of the trees growing upon and about the cemetery as should be felled, and that application be made to the RCB, the representative church body, for securing permission to demolish them. What else? Yeah, 1911, April 1911, resolved that when the weather becomes suitable, the leak in the archway over the entrance to the cemetery to be staunched. And October 1911, with reference to the water supply to the caretaker's house, that a fountain be erected on the roadside opposite the Automobile Club signpost at the Roman Catholic Cemetery, and the cost of same not to exceed £10. So I'm afraid both the Automobile Club sign and the fountain have since disappeared, or at least I can't find any trace of them. So that's just a very quick flick through the history of the graveyard down there. But I suppose of more importance, or of more interest maybe, are the people who are buried there. And as I say, we did some little snippets down there earlier in the month. So hopefully, if the Reverend Philip can work the technology, you can have a look at that. So we're standing here outside the historic and interesting cemetery of Maudlins in Naas. And before we go into the cemetery itself, there are a few features on the entrance here which are worth noting. The first is an inscription which is in two parts near the top of the arch, continued on both sides. And the inscription says that the cemetery was donated by Lord Naas. The actual inscription is Lord Naas, in testimony of his regard for the parish, bequeathed to them a lasting habitation not made with hands. And the date for that is 1780. So the land was donated by Lord Naas and opened as a cemetery shortly after that. In fact, it appears on a map of Kildare by the famous cartographer, Lieutenant Alexander Taylor, which was made in 1783. And he marks this on his map as a burying ground. And we'll come back to Alexander Taylor later. The other feature worth noting is this mark here at the base of the arch. This is a mark from the first Ordnance Survey of Ireland, which was carried out in 1837. These marks are known by various names around the country. They're sometimes referred to as surveyor's marks or sapper's marks, or some people refer to them as crow's feet because that's what they resemble. This particular mark here is 309 feet above sea level. So we're standing 309 feet above sea level as measured at low tide, spring tide in Dublin Bay in August 1837. Okay, well, the first memorial which strikes one when one comes in the gate is probably this beautiful piece of red marble. It's a memorial to a family called Sutcliffe, and it's clear from the inscription that Joseph Rowland Sutcliffe was the manager of the Hibernian Bank in Naas. And of course the Hibernian Bank subsequently became the Bank of Ireland. It was amalgamated. So I think this probably sets the tone for all the great and good who are buried here in Maudlins Cemetery. This section here is largely comprised of families from the Johnstown and Kill areas. In fact, this stone here commemorates a William Wills. And I've discovered from looking at the Griffiths valuations of the 1850s that he actually lived in the house that I live in now in Johnstown. It's one of the old Gothic Revival cottages there. So he's recorded as the owner there in the 1850s. Another stone over there commemorates the Lendrum family. Again, they lived in Johnstown. They lived in what was the constabulary barracks in Johnstown in the 1850s. The family later became famous for setting up a sawmills, initially in Johnstown along the banks of the little river there, and then subsequently in Naas. They had quite a big sawmills business in Naas, down where the canal stores are now. Beyond that, there are some stones commemorating well-known Kill families, such as the Gillespies and the Lyons family. There's a headstone there to Thomas Sandal Lyons, who would be the father of our well-known and well-loved centenarian Mabel Lyons, and also, of course, the father of her brother Ernest, who came to fame as a motorcycle rider, winning the Isle of Man TT Trophy in 1948. The man who was dubbed the Kildare Demon by Miles Nagopoline in the Irish Times for his feats of motorbike riding. Okay, so we're in the family plot here of the de Burgh family, one of the most famous families around Naas, claiming descent from the de Burghs who came to Ireland with the Norman invasion. And the family originally had estates down near Limerick, but in the late 17th century, the original member of the de Burgh family purchased a large estate here in Naas of about 3,000 acres, and the family have been settled here ever since. He was he was Surveyor General of Ireland, a well-known architect, responsible for designing sections of Dublin Castle, the Upper Yard, Trinity College Library, Collins Barracks. A number of public buildings are attributed to him. Oldest de Burgh stone in here is this one here, which commemorates a Charles de Burgh who died in 1793. So not that long after the cemetery here was established. Another interesting feature to note here is this metal frame. In the 1980s, when we did a survey of this graveyard for the Naas Local History Group, there remains very, very worn and weathered of a wooden cross here, and there was a little plaque to say that the cross had been set up in South Africa to commemorate one of the de Burghs who had been killed in the Boer War. It said something like this rude cross marked his graveyard in South Africa. It was set up by his brother and was then brought back here, and obviously his body was brought back here and reinterred. So that's just the remains of that wooden cross. Some interesting stones here. The de Burgh family, obviously based at Old Town for years, very much a military family. Many of the family had careers in the Royal Navy and in the various colonial wars. Lieutenant Colonel T.J. de Burgh was a famous historian at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. He compiled a number of articles for the early volumes of the Kildare Archaeological Society Journal, and he was president of the society for many years, and he recorded a lot of valuable information about the early history of Naas. Yes, this is one which has always intrigued me here. George de Burgh, erected by his mother to the dear memory of her much beloved son who died deeply repenting of his sins. He viewed himself as a brand plucked out of the fire. So one wonders, is there a story behind that? It's rather pointed, referring to him repenting of his sins. Back here, Captain Hubert de Burgh, Royal Navy. As I say, one of many of the family who had careers in the Royal Navy. And coming more up to date, this is all of us who lived around here would have known the late Major de Burgh of Old Town, who the last of the family to reside there in the family home. He died in 2010, and his wife Claire died in November 2016, 5 years ago. So the estate has now been sold. So they were the last of the de Burghs to live there. We're standing here outside not one of two pyramid-style mausolea, and Maudlins is unique in having two, I think, in the British Isles. There was a fashion for constructing these sort of memorials in the early 19th century, It would have been related to the whole fascination with Egypt at that time. We have a date for the erection of this pyramid, 1843. It's recorded in the inscription on the back. But I would draw your attention here to the coat of arms above the door, which is the coat of arms of the Burgh family. It's actually a red cross on a white background. The motto is A Cruce Salus, through the cross is salvation. And the story goes that the origins of that coat of arms go back to one of the early wars involving one of the crusades involving Richard the Lionheart, King Richard, who was accompanied by one of the de Burghs, who killed one of the Saracen leaders in battle. And King Richard is supposed to have dipped his thumb in the blood and traced the sign of the cross on de Burgh's chest and said, "This will be your mark from now on." So an interesting and colourful story, but that's the story attaching to the de Burgh coat of arms. Okay, so we're now standing at the back of the de Burgh or Burgh Pyramid, and we have an inscription here which records the setting up of the memorial, gives us a date for it, and it's a wonderful example of the sort of Victorian flowery language around piety and virtue and so on. I'll read you the inscription. It says, "Sacred to the memory of Elizabeth Jane Hussey Burgh, otherwise Fitzgerald, eminently distinguished by unaffected humility, exemplary piety and Christian charity, approaching dissolution had no terrors for her who died in the blessed hope of eternal life through the merits of Christ alone. In grateful remembrance of his disinterested affection, this mausoleum is erected by her afflicted widower, who best knew her worth and revered her virtues, as a monument to her departed worth and as a resting place for himself and his family in the future. Walter Hussey Burgh, Esquire, of Donore in this county, grandson to the late celebrated patriot Walter Hussey Burgh, Lord Chief Baron of His Majesty's Court of Exchequer in Ireland, and member of the Irish House of Commons for Trinity College Dublin. She departed this life the 7th day of February in the year of our Lord 1834, in the 33rd year of her age, leaving one son and 7 daughters to mourn their irreplaceable loss." So he's pointing there to the fact that he's the grandson of a famous patriot, Walter Hussey Burgh, who was a member of the Irish Parliament in the late 18th century, the famous Grattan's Parliament, who were noted for their patriotism and who were pushing for legislative independence from England at the time. Walter Hussey Burgh was also a bit unusual for his time. He was very ecumenical. He was very much in favour of Catholic emancipation. There are lots of interesting stories told about him, but a very interesting gentleman, and would have been very famous at his time. He was also regarded as the greatest orator of his day. That's why he's pointing to his illustrious ancestors in this case. So this is the plot of the Earls of Clonmel. You can see the Earls' coronets on the headstones there. The Clonmels, the family name was Scott. Their main estates were down in Tipperary, hence the Earls of Clonmel, but they also had a big house and a smaller estate here in Kildare, as did many of the titled families in the 18th century, because they were also members of Parliament. So it was close to Dublin. They could get into Dublin very easily. Local base for the Clonmels here was Bishop's Court, a large mansion up in Kill, and that's where they moved to when Parliament was in session. There are a number of interesting stories. They seem to have been a very colourful family. You can see the 3rd, 4th, 5th Earls all buried here. The famous Anglo-Irish commentator Mark Bence-Jones collected a number of interesting stories about the Clonmels. The 3rd Earl, for example, one of the stories told about him is that at a ball in Dublin Castle, The family seemed to have been rather fond of the drop, and he was slightly inebriated on the occasion, and he's reputed to have gone over and sat down in the lap of a large, plump, brocaded dowager, mistaking it for an armchair. That's the story that's told. The other story that's told about the fourth Earl is that at a ball over in England, which was attended by the Queen, Queen Victoria at the time, she was processing around the room and smiled at the fourth Earl, who immediately rushed over to her, pumped her warmly by the hand, and said something along the lines of, I know your face, but I can't remember the name. So again, I think he might have been more than a little inebriated on the occasion. But I suppose for our purposes, one of the more interesting would have been the first Earl himself, John Scott, or Jack was his nickname. Again, he was very fond of his after-dinner port, and developed a rather ruddy red complexion as a result of that. So his nickname amongst his friends and behind his back was Copper-Faced Jack. And in fact, the Clonmels had a townhouse in Dublin, in Harcourt Street, and it's after that same gentleman that the well-known Irish nightclub Copper-Faced Jack is named. This is the plot of the de Robeck family, the Barnes de Robeck, a rather unusual family. The family name is Fock, F-O-C-K. Their origins are actually in Sweden. They acquired their title, the Barnes de Robeck, in Sweden in the middle of the 18th century. By the late 18th century, again, they were a military family that found their way into the French army, and they fought in the continental wars in America on the French side against the British. But one of them married an Irish heiress. They moved to England initially. Rather unusual given that they had been fighting the English, but their timing was impeccable because they got out of France just as the French Revolution happened. And of course all the aristocracy were losing their heads. So they moved to England, then to Ireland. They set up in Gowran Grange, which is another estate just outside Naas, and they've been there ever since. And in fact they are the only one of the titled families in this area who are still in their original, maintaining their original estate out at Gowran Grange. One of the more famous members of the family was Admiral Jack de Robeck, who commanded the British fleet at the Dardanelles. He took over, he was Vice Admiral at the time, but the Admiral, who was called Carden, had essentially a nervous breakdown going into that battle, so de Robeck took over, and it was a bit of a military disaster. They lost many ships and had to withdraw, and de Robeck was the one who made that decision. It didn't make him very popular with Churchill, I believe, but it was the correct decision because that whole campaign was a disaster. So yeah, the de Robecks are still there out in Gowran Grange. And they are the only ones. This plot here belongs to the Maudlin family, another famous family both in Kildare and indeed nationally in Ireland. Originally a Quaker family, the Maudlins, very much associated with milling. They were the owners of the Leinster Mills, which is or was down along the Grand Canal, the other side of Naas. Associated with milling throughout the country, associated with the production of meal, oats and so on. And I think we all in our younger days were familiar with the Oudlums packets of porridge oatlets. I think every kitchen in Ireland had one at the time. So there are a number of the Oudlums buried here. William Claude Audlum, born 1884, died 1979. Diana Mavis, a daughter, and Doris, another daughter. So another well-known family. So here we are at the second pyramid mausoleum in Maudlins. A bit more mystery around this one. There's always been a question mark over who is buried there, who commissioned it. There's no inscription on it, as there is on the first one. Very similar in style, so probably erected around the same time. It's sometimes been suggested that it's another de Burgh Pyramid, or also one belonging to the Burgh family, the Earls of Mayo. But we know, in fact, from an entry in the parish registers that this pyramid was the burial place of a family called Montgomery. Again, a large estate-owning family with roots in the north of Ireland. There would originally have been settlers from Scotland, had large estates up north, but again moved down here to Kildare. They built a house which still exists along the banks of the canal. It's called the Naas. It would be well known to most Naas people. The family obviously long since departed. There are mentions of them in connection with the rebellion of 1798 around Naas, when some of the rebels were supposed to have been killed up around the Naas. So again, a family with an interesting history, and a most interesting mausoleum, which is quite well preserved inside. And I should, of course, mention here the excellent work which has been done in the past year by the Follies Trust in restoring these pyramids with the assistance of Kildare County Council. The pyramids were in very poor condition. A lot of vegetation had made its way into the fabric, and they were in serious danger of disintegrating. So as you can see, a fabulous job of work has been done on restoring them in the last 12 months, notwithstanding lockdown. This cross here commemorates Cecil Francis Blacker, a lieutenant in the 2nd Battalion of the Connaught Rangers, one of the early casualties, and there were many casualties of families around this area in the First World War. He actually died of wounds received at the Battle of Mons, August 1914, so right at the start of the First World War, the Battle of Mons. His father was also a major in the British Army. He lived in Johnstown, in what was the old land agent's house in Johnstown. There's a very sad description of the funeral of Cecil Blacker, his body arriving at Sallins railway station and being conveyed by horse and carriage here to the graveyard in Maudlins, and the procession being joined by a number of members of the army who were home on leave at the time. Cecil Blacker was an only son. His mother was absolutely distraught when he was killed, and there are local stories that in the house in Johnstown she turned to the occult in an attempt to communicate with her dead son. And there are stories of seances being held in that house in Johnstown. But that's a story for another day. This plot belongs to the Aylmer family, one of the many branches of the Aylmer family. The Aylmers were probably the largest landowners in Kildare in the 17th century. branches of the family in different parts of the county. This is the branch in Cardiffstown, which is another large house and estate across the N7 from Kill and Johnstown. The house there in recent years was owned by the Vincent de Paul Society. It was owned by Cement Roadstone before that. The Aylmers and the Hendricks, who married into the family, are buried in these plots here. Another casualty of the First World War, Gerald Hans Hendrik Aylmer, a lieutenant in the Royal Inniskill and Fusiliers, died in France in 1917. Some of the Aylmers buried here are from Courtown, which is another branch of the family. And this stone here commemorates a Major Mengi, again, who married into the Aylmer family. And I remember talking to some people in Johnstown, old people, when I moved there, who remembered the Major up in Cardiffstown House. This large enclosure here is the interment place of the Burgh family, the Earls of Mayo. This is a family which also traces their ancestry back to the original de Burghs. Now that day, because they were in the west of Ireland, they became more Gaelicised. They adopted the name Burke. This particular branch were known as the MacWilliam Uchters. Most of their estates were in Mayo and in Galway, but again they had a big house and a sizable estate at Palmerstown here, near Johnstown. Again, there were members of Parliament and so on, very much members of the establishment all through the 18th, 19th century and so on. This enclosure was put here by the 4th Earl of Mayo, who was one of the wealthier members of the family, mainly because he married an English heiress. It was he who was responsible for reconstruction of the house at Palmerstown, the building of workmen's cottages, very picturesque and stylish cottages in Johnstown and originally in Kill. He also endowed the church, St David's Church here in Naas, and he enclosed this as a burial area for his family and for his descendants and so on. Now there is a marble plaque. It's in rather poor condition at the moment, as you can see, but there is a marble plaque just above the mausoleum there with the date 1843. And in fact, when we were doing the survey of the graveyard here in the 1980s, you could go in and look down and you could see where the mausoleum had been sealed up, and the bier which had been used to convey the coffin for the last interment there was simply pushed down outside the doorway of the mausoleum. So the later Earls of Mayo in fact ended up being buried in several different places in Johnstown and so on. The interments probably ceased with the 4th Earl here. This plot belongs to the Moore family of Killashee, sometimes known as the St Leger Moors. Again, a large estate on the outskirts of Naas. They built a large Jacobean-style mansion there in the 1850s. Today it's a luxury hotel. Killashee is a very ancient ecclesiastical site, and in fact there was a church in Killashee up until it was decommissioned, deconsecrated in the 1960s. So the early members of the Moore family are buried in Killashee, but the later members of the family are buried here in Maudlins, and they are commemorated here. As you can see, this burial place was enclosed by Richard Moore, Esquire. So the family were there until 1927, when the estate was sold and was taken over by an order of French nuns. And as I say, in more recent times, it's now become a hotel, the Killashee Hotel. Remember, we mentioned at the start Alexander Taylor, Lieutenant Alexander Taylor, making a map of this area in 1783 and marking the cemetery here as a burial ground. Now, Alexander Taylor carried out this map in 1783. It was a very good, detailed map of Kildare. We're very lucky to have it. It predates the Ordnance Survey by 50 years, but it gives a very good and accurate picture of roads, buildings, everything in Kildare at that time. So how does he come to be buried here in Maudlins himself? Something he probably never thought when he was carrying out his map. Well, the answer, of course, is love. He married a Naas lady, Elizabeth Bonner, and lived in Naas for most of his later life, and ends up being buried here. Alexander Taylor, Royal Engineers, died 1828. So another of the distinguished people buried here in Maudlins. Another family of high achievers buried here in Maudlins with a rather elaborate memorial in memory of William Hargrave, Esquire, Member of Parliament, lived in Upper Mount Street in Dublin, Fellow and ex-President of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, died in 1874. And on another section around here we get another inscription to another member of the family. This is in affectionate remembrance of their dear father, H.G.B. Hargrave, M.A., M.I.C.E., Shrewsbury Road, Dublin, late Chief Engineer of the B.B.&C. India Railway Company. And I've been told that's the Bombay, Bengal and Calcutta India Railway Company. He died in 1905, so very much redolent of British Empire. And also there's a memorial to his wife, Augusta Blanche, who died in Malabar Hill in Bombay, and she died in 1888. Some more of our distinguished burials here in Maudlins. One of the things one might notice if one looks at the headstones in this cemetery, or indeed any of the cemeteries around this area for the late 19th to early 20th century, is the names of the stonemasons who actually carved the headstones. And one of the most notable of these would have been the family of Sargent in Naas, a well-known monumental sculptors in Naas. You'll find their names on the base of a lot of the headstones in this graveyard and other graveyards. And there's an interesting section of such stones along here. Some interesting families again. This commemorates the Ecret family. They were a family of builders. They were involved certainly in the reconstruction of the town hall in Naas in 1903. Before that, the town hall was a jail, and before that a castle, but it was rebuilt in its present style in, I think it was 1903, and the builder was Ecret. Up here we have another interesting stone, the Devlin family. John James Devlin, editor of the Leinster Leader, died in 1930, and the rest of his family are buried there as well. But I draw your attention to this stone here. Again, same style, same carving and so on, but in this case it's in loving memory of our dear son Henry Francis Sargent, died in 1929. And in fact he's the son of George Sargent, who was the sculptor for these stones. His son died in a motor accident, a very tragic motor accident in 1929. And what I've noticed looking at the stone is that unlike all of the others, it doesn't actually have George Sargent's name at the bottom. So one wonders, was he too heartbroken? Could he just not bring himself to put his usual mark on the bottom of the stone? So probably a suitably poignant story to end our little tour of Maudlin Cemetery.
Brian, thank you very much. And we come to that part of the evening. I'm sure we have lots of questions. So for those who are watching online, if you can send your questions in the Q&A section, and I'm just going to go through. Liam, I think you have questions. No? Any questions for Brian? Yeah, Primrose?
I was just wondering about the famous case that you mentioned in Scotland, which brought to the end the a horrible situation of the resurrection men, or whatever they were, other names they were called. I'm sorry, I'm afraid I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, it was two gentlemen called Burke and Hare. They were heavily involved in the background to that whole business. Of course, was medical research. Really, it was dissecting the bodies. Medical students and the teaching establishments always needed bodies for that. And I think initially it was people like murderers and so on, and their bodies were kind of used for that. But then over time, they started simply lifting bodies out of graveyards, and I suppose inevitably it spilled over into, in the case of Burke and Hare, certainly, they didn't wait for the people to die. They were actually killing them, sort of targeting what we would now call vulnerable people, down and outs and so on. And there was a notorious case of that in Scotland, and that led then inevitably to an act of Parliament to sort of regulate the whole area and allow bodies to be procured legitimately for research purposes. So that brought an end to the body snatchers.
Can I ask, Brian, in Maudlins there's an awful lot of small gravestones. Are those always for children?
I don't think so, Philip. I was making this point, I think, to somebody earlier. Going back certainly into the 19th century, a lot of families wouldn't have been able to afford very elaborate headstones. So in some cases it was a very simple stone, sometimes a very small stone, and in a lot of cases no stone at all, maybe just a simple grave marker, a distinctive stone that was placed on the grave. So, of course, you do get, certainly these days you get small stones for children, but not necessarily the case, I think, back then.
Yeah, Liam?
Well, firstly, and thank you, Brian, and also Philip. I mean, the production values on that would do. I don't know, somebody like Michael Palin or somebody like that would be very, very impressed. And thank you for that. This is something, I don't know, maybe Primrose might know something about or whatever. But I suppose the question of the pyramidal tombs. What was behind that shape? What was behind the elaborate construction? Do we know anything about, there was very precise measurement, was there some kind of an architect involved? And also fairly specialised construction techniques. So do we know anything about the logistics, if you like, of the building? That's one more. Shall I go back to yeah.
To be honest, we don't know if there was an architect for these particular structures, and I think from the way in which they were constructed, I doubt that there was one. But there are a number of pyramids in Ireland. perhaps one of the best known in this area is the one at Kinnity in County Offaly. And if you go and look at it, it's particularly beautifully constructed. Actually, the lines of the stones, you know the way they run, whatever way it is, in lines, the lines run downwards. But the one in Kinnity, the lines run across the door, the cast iron door as well. It was just an obsession at the time with all things Egyptian that really seemed to have brought it about. I'm not quite sure why it started in Ireland, but you see, I think perhaps a lot of these men served abroad in the army, and some of them would have gone to Egypt and would have seen the pyramids, and brought it home as a legitimate way of commemorating the dead, as it was in Egypt. And so I think that's really where it comes from. That sounds rather vague answer, and it probably isn't what you wanted to know, actually, but I'm afraid I don't know a great deal more than that about it. But I think, to me, pure geometrical shapes are so pleasing to the eye. I think they're absolutely beautiful. That's one of the reasons why the Follies Trust was so keen to do these two structures in Maudlins. You know, when you saw the camera panning around and you could see the pyramids in the background, it did feel terribly satisfying, didn't it? You know, to your eye. And I think they are really beautiful, really lovely shapes. As I say, we're very pleased to have worked on them and to have been so hugely supported by everybody in Kildare. And I think we should probably bring it to a close unless there's any questions that are on the screen that you want to ask. Are there? Oh, sorry, Roberta. No, I didn't realise that
The cost. Brian mentioned some figures there, and for the time they must have been prohibitive. I think a child was 3 shillings and 6pence. That would have been an enormous amount of money at that time, and an adult was 5 shillings. And also, at that time, would that money have gone to the caretaker who lived in the Maudlins cottage? And you also mentioned about putting up, they seem to have taken care of headstones, all other adornments seem to have been done by the parish.
Yeah, I don't really know very much about that history. Brian would be the best one to answer the historical questions, but I think this is something that happened all around Ireland and England as well, that there were people who lived in the gate lodges at the front of the graveyards, isn't that correct?
Yes.
And who very much acted as gravediggers, who looked after the day-to-day. And I think one of your the people who lived in that cottage used to keep sheep, which kept the grass down in the graveyard. Seemed to me entirely practical. Wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, in the case of the pyramids, the caretaker only got the fees from 1877 onwards, so he wouldn't have got whatever was paid. Actually, it's a good point because, you know, if they were drawing up those charges in 1877, we don't know what the story was before then, you know, what the charges were. But you're right. I mean, the cost of putting those two pyramids in place must have been fairly extensive.
I won't say average because there are people who spoke about are not average, you know what I mean. But you could, as you say, 3 to 6 for a child, 5 shillings for an adult. If you think about what the wage levels were.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly wasn't a cheap way to commemorate your dead, that's for sure. But I suppose it shows the regard in which the de Burgh held his wife and wished to commemorate her. You know, it was quite interesting that Andrew Tierney suggested that maybe he married very quickly after she died, age 33, and he married very quickly, and he suggested that maybe it was the second wife wanted one for her as well. But that isn't true, of course. But it was a nice story as well to just add. I think it's good when these stories come about. So nothing particular to ask, is there,
Nothing,
Philip?
Just a few messages of thanks for a wonderful lecture, and certainly, Brian, that was really, really fascinating. I was at Maudlins this morning, and really having gone round the graveyard with you, I don't know if this is possible, but it brought the graveyard to life. But thank you very much. So I think we can close now.
Yeah, I think it was an absolutely super lecture. Brian, we're very, very grateful to you. Philip, we're very grateful to you too. And it's lovely to think that we now have this tremendous record of the people who were buried in the graveyard. And I hope it's okay if I conclude with a couple of lines that somebody wrote. And they wrote them actually after the handing over the keys ceremony. And Lydia Ingalls handed this to me afterwards. It's titled Egyptian Pyramids in Ireland. Stone statues of times past, quiet guardians on a busy road where horses trod. When the pyramids were first conceived, curiosities, exotic towers to admire on a weekend picnic. Death still far enough away not to trouble, but hovering in the background. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming here. Thank you for watching online. And thank you very much indeed, Brian. It's been a great evening. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Lovely set of lines there, mate.
She just wrote them and then handed them to you. She left. So, very nice.